view 3D models as is they're not just representing the 3D nature of the geology, which is obviously important, but they're trying to represent our full understanding of the ore system and all of the controls present. And so you should be able to look at the geological model and essentially see why is gold, assuming gold is your commodity, but why is gold there and where can we find more of it? And the other thing that they're used for that is pretty underappreciated is facilitating that collaboration between the different stakeholders. So the engineers use these models, the production geologists use these models, the exploration geologists use the models, planning teams use it. And so it has to be robust enough that it can be a talking point between all those groups. And then I think one of the biggest things they're used for is obviously one of the main inputs to resource estimation. And so if you don't have a good geological model to create your domains for your resource estimate, you're going to have very poor resource estimate. I think there's been a number of cases in the news that we can see that's happened. And then finally, well, actually, there's more, but finally, exploration targeting. So we should be able to look at our geological model and use it to work up our exploration targets. So we should be able to have things in there like our geophysics and our geochemistry and our structures and everything else that we might want to use to actually drill holes and find more gold. So some of the main pitfalls is failure to communicate between the modelers and the data collectors. And this is something that I've seen on a variety of scales, from minor miscommunications to flat out refusal to talk to the production geologists who might be collecting what could be the majority of our structural data used in a model. And that can have huge consequences. We can start building something that doesn't have anything to do with reality, and we might not have any method to fact check it. So another one is kind of failing to understand the fractal nature geology. And I've seen a number of resource models over the years that had a specific geometry that you could never see in the field. And so you should always be able to see things on a deposit scale and a camp scale that you can see in an individual drift or in the face of one of the headings, or even in an open pit. And if you're failing to see those features, it usually means that your model's incorrect. Some of this can stem from like failure to collect your correct data. So there's a lot of different data sources that we use in modeling. So drilling and geochemistry and mapping and geophysics and remote sensing and everything. But sometimes people substitute quantity for quality. And so they'll have, I don't know, a ton of structural measurements, but then they might not actually have the key structural measurements. So maybe they have a lot of bedding measurements. But what might actually matter is the intersection between bedding and foliation. And that intersection lineation will be potentially a control on mineralization that would go unrecognized. And I've worked in a number of deposits where this has happened, where essentially people either said it was too confusing or too complex to understand, and so people stopped trying to understand it, or they had rejected some of the subtleties and said, no, well, this big thing is what's controlling it. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it completely lies in the subtleties. Another real big failure is failing to utilize that data that we've already collected. So teams will go through and they'll spend a huge amount of time mapping every day underground or in the open pit. And sometimes that doesn't get used in the geological models. Sometimes the geological modelers don't understand how to use it. There's really complex data sources that aren't always just a direct input into building a surface, for example, in Leapfrog. We can also fail to QA/QC our data properly. And so if we have downhole surveys that are not where they're supposed to be because we're using a single shot system in a highly magnetic environment, we can have drill holes that are sometimes hundreds of feet away from where we think they are. So if you try to build a geological model and your drill holes are so far away from where you believe them to be, it's pretty well worthless. And so it's really important not just to QAQC our gold, but to QAQC our structural oriented core data collection, to QAQC our mapping, to QAQC the downhole surveys and collar surveys. We can also use improper data where sometimes we'll think that a data set is really good because it matches maybe our preconceived notions, and we'll throw it into the model and it doesn't work. And then one of the other common ones is improper assumptions, thinking that this thing matters and that thing doesn't. So there's a lot of areas to go wrong in geological modeling. And the consequences can be huge. So there's been, in the last 10 years, there's been a number of mines that have had to shut down entirely because the resource estimation was wrong. There's been big resource estimation write-downs where companies have essentially not domained things correctly or not estimated things correctly and had huge revisions. There's been mines that have been built incorrectly where, for example, I worked at a mine that had been built for a certain tonnage per day. And when they got down to the veins, they found that they were 10 times smaller than they thought they were because they were of a different orientation than what was assumed. And so now instead of a 500 ton a day mine, it was going to be a 100 ton a day mine. And that can have a major impact on how you're actually going to do as a company. And then there's, sorry, my son's playing music in the background. And then you can have poor reconciliation, where essentially you go into mine an area and the gold's not there. And it's maybe globally the resource estimation has the right amount of ounces for the deposit, but locally they're not where they're supposed to be at. And that's a huge issue at mines all over the world. And that results in poor mine performance, where we never realize the profits that we need to see from them. So we can avoid it, at least we can almost always avoid it, I would say, by essentially trying to address some of these things. So collecting appropriate data and in a format that you can actually use directly in your modeling software. So I've seen this a lot where, for example, some of the, like on the map on the right, if we were modeling veins cutting through a system or dikes cutting through a system, if you draw it out and then you digitize it as a polygon, it's much harder to use than if you say, oh, let's digitize the hanging wall as a specific line and then the footwall as a specific line. You can use those things directly in modeling. And one of the things that I've seen throughout my career is essentially a lack of time in the mine environment to actually get everything the way we want it to be. And so the more time you can save up front, the more time you can spend thinking about the geology and not digitizing points. We also need to build an understanding of our ore system controls. And so there's everything from small scale controls to large that I've seen even world-class mining companies get wrong. And so I recently went out into an open pit at a previous operator I worked for. And the geology was modeled to be flat-lying. And in the high wall of the deposit, you could see a gigantic fold. And the mineralization was following the fold hinge lines. And it wasn't even captured in the model. And it was essentially a failure to actually reconcile what was going on in the open pits to what was going on behind the computer screen. And if we look at drill holes alone to try and build our models, we can end up with some really disastrous consequences. One of the things I wanted to talk about, like earlier we mentioned the fractal scale of nature. The lower image here is actually a structural geology map of the Witwatersrand Basin. So the entire Rand, as it was in the 70s. And so now that like further to the south of here, there's South Deeps and things like that. But you could look at this and see almost the exact same controls on a drift. If you were to imagine that outline instead of being province, if it was actually just an underground drift, this looks pretty much like what you'd see underground in a lot of mines. And being able to properly capture this in the time allotted for mapping is really critical. And so it takes a lot of going back and forth between the people mapping and the people modeling to say, all right, why is there gold here? What's the orientation look like? And what do we see down at the face itself? And that data, that communication is critical. If we're collecting oriented core, but we're not communicating with the drillers and finding out that the core orientations are being done correctly, all of our data that we've collected is garbage. And so then the modeler, if they're not aware of that, they might believe that it's valid data. And so there's so many steps we have to go through to understand this, and really to understand those implications across scales. And then that kind of brings me to really trying to understand our systems. And this is where I basically my presentation is going to end shortly after this for the aforementioned catastrophic loss. But what I really want to try and spell out to all the graduates and undergraduates on this call is, I think I've seen a lot of grad students get hired at mining companies or any other company and have their research skills dismissed and discarded, where essentially they show up and they're like, no, you're going to log core and that's all you're going to do. And so instead of this big effort at data collection and trying to understand what the data is, which is what their entire master's and PhD programs were doing, was actually what is the answer here. They're thrown into an environment where sometimes it can be just day-to-day grind. Go get samples, go map, and log core. And one of the things that we're trying to do with Newmont is really change that paradigm and change it to trying to really understand our ore system. And so I have some examples here and all these figures are from papers I grabbed off of ResearchGate, so I didn't have to worry about confidentiality. And so these are all different efforts that people have gone through trying to understand the genesis of these systems through time. And so the figure on the left I really liked because they went through a number of different major mines and figured out what the kinematics were for those mines. And when you put those into a regional understanding, you can begin to understand what's happening that's causing the mines to form where they're at. And then you can start to look at what are the exploration implications, or even what are the production implications. And so the same idea of going from an underground system where you're on geoline and you're steering the heading and the miners are trying to follow the lines that you're predicting of where gold's going to be. If you don't understand that geology, you might say, oh, it goes straight, or you might say, oh, it goes left. And if you were to look at the data around you and then know what the structural regime in your mine is, you might say, oh, okay, so if this is making a jog to the right, we should see a dilatant zone. And so this zone might get a little bit thicker up here. And let's stick to the hanging wall side of the contact rather than driving down the middle and potentially diluting either side. Or you might take and use it on an exploration setting where you say, okay, so we're drilling this structure and we see it's beginning to deflect to the left. And because we know that this was the structural regime at the time, we should see, instead of an extensional system, we should see a series of stacked low angle structures from a compression setting. And we'll want to change our drill orientation to try and take advantage of that. So it's a really important aspect, is this understanding the entire mineral system that is often overlooked in this attempt to estimate and build geological models. So it's not just trying to match drill holes, it's trying to understand the why. And I think from what I've seen, most grad students go into graduate programs because they really want to build their understanding of the why in systems. And I would encourage all of you guys to not let go of that if you go into industry, but to continue trying to pursue it and find a way at the mine or the exploration department or whatever setting you end up at, that you can continue to use those skills. Because I think a lot of minds have pushed back and said, oh no, this is the way it's been for 115 years and that's the way it is, and have failed to adapt to new ideas and have failed to adapt to what those implications to their exploration programs are. And so we always talk about the challenges and the increasing difficulty of exploring undercover and exploring with diminished mines, because most of the outcropping mines have already been found. So now we're going to have to start finding mines at depth. And some of those are going to be from extensions of, obvious things like geochemistry, like, oh, there's an anomaly at surface, let's drill underneath it. But I'd argue that a lot of those systems have been found. So what we really need to start pivoting to is understanding what's happening in the systems in 3 dimensions. And that's going to take a lot of effort from hopefully graduate students coming into industry and bringing those ideas and steering their research projects to try and answer some of those questions. And so I made a kind of a simple little geological model in Leapfrog for part of this discussion. And what we had on the right was a little bit of mapping. So you can see like there's some green lines, and actually I left off in one of the mini figures that was deleted. There's a bunch of structural data and things like that, and this is completely made up. But what we can build from that is with keen observations where, we can look at structure, like intersection lineations and stretching lineations, and then we can put the foliation and unit contacts into perspective and start trying to understand what's really happening. And from those kind of lines of a fairly unintelligible contact on the right, which is, well, in this case, it's between an ultramafic and a mafic unit, we can actually build a pretty tangible 3D model, and we can see where those contacts have gone on the different levels in the mine at depth, and we can begin exploring just how much data we can extract from this. And so instead of just forming a stereo net, I'm going to try this. We'll see if it works. But I'm going to try to throw this into Leapfrog, and if all goes well, we can actually drive a little bit in 3D. And so we'll head back over to the scene view. And so, and again, this being a fairly simplistic model, I just built a couple made up underground workings and started kind of assigning some data to them. Can you guys see this still? Hopefully.
Yes, we can see it.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. And so kind of threw together, maybe this would be a long hole stoping operation where we drive in from the side and then we develop stope panels along our veins. And so what we had was essentially a little bit of underground data where we had foliation, we had some unit contacts in there, and then we had the same thing from some surface mapping. And so, this is fairly standard to have, like a fair bit of data that can sometimes be kind of overwhelming. And we were able to trace out the contacts on the surface for this ultramafic to greenstone. And then we had a diabase dike cutting across the system as well. And so one of the things we can do from this is we can start looking at how we map things and then how they can be brought directly into the model. So for example, if we find this diabase throughout the mine, we might have a hanging wall and a footwall contact. And if we map these as polygons, which is how most of the time they're represented on a map, is there'll be a closed shape. We have a hard time using that data directly. But if we start looking at, well, how does it need to be incorporated into the model? And we can then begin to build things specifically. And so in this case, we've built a diabase dike that matches our underground mapping pretty well. And that's late and it cuts through the rest of the system. But we also built, from our understanding that we developed from the geological mapping, we were able to build a fairly cohesive, highly folded unit. And so, you know, and I think you guys have probably all looked at stereo nets and used them. And so I took essentially all of my different measurements that I collected. And like most things, most of my measurements are on the limbs of the folds with only a very few points throughout the nose of the fold. But from that, we actually can see that we have an intersection, we have our fold axial hinge line is rooted around about the same point as our stretching lineation is. And so if I were to bring those categories in so we can see them. So you can see, yeah, you can see there's our stretching lineation that we've mapped throughout the project. And this is not too dissimilar to things that I've observed in the real world. So it's based on a very common observance. And so we can say, okay, well, it turns out that our folding is kind of similar to that stretching lineation direction. And then we can look at things like our fold axes that we measured on surface and say, okay, let's go back to the modeling side of it. And let's see if we can take these disparate contacts and we can apply a trend to them that we derived from that modeling. And so if we were to take this surface, expand it out, you can see that we have essentially a maximum direction that's very similar to our lineations that we observed earlier. And so we can then apply that and we can make a fairly cohesive geological model, which is the ultimate goal of things. And then we can take our vein mapping as well and bring that in. And so we've mapped veins in these different places. And I'll change the color so we can actually see them. Again, so this was normally actually like PowerPoint slides, but I had to nuke it all. So, and sorry. It's never my ideal to do presentations live with a leapfrog model. It's almost always guaranteed to be failure. But we can see that there's where our veins were mapped on different levels. And if we had continued to go through and essentially just map these all as vein, we have a very hard time modeling this. But if we can break these out and domain them out as to separate things and say, okay, this is, we'll call it vein one in this example, we can begin modeling individual veins that map or match that geometry and match the geological data that we've observed in mapping. And so we can begin putting together a fairly reasonable geological model from not a huge amount of data. And I don't even have any drilling in here. And when we have good domaining like this, we can do good estimation because you can see that even though they're not perfect, because it is leapfrog, we have a pretty good match between what we've mapped in our veins and what we've modeled. And so when we go to create a resource estimation from this, it'll be much more robust than if we just thrown together a basic vein model or maybe model them as intrusions and things. So not the world's best example, again, because I'm trying to make it be completely like not one of our projects or anything like that. But it's the critical importance of essentially trying to build that understanding through observation and communication. And so at that point, that's all I've got because of my unfortunate failure of technology. So I figured it might be good to open it up for maybe a discussion and question and answers.
Thanks, Scott. That was great. I'm sorry that your PowerPoint dumped you, but so if anybody has a question, unmute yourself or just type it into the chat, whatever you like.
So if we don't get any questions, I could keep talking, but I figured it's better to get questions. How many of you guys are working on projects that are at existing mine operations? You guys raise hands? Or
good question. I wonder if I had to give a number, I'd be able to. So I have a project at Midas and Fire Creek. Those are both care, and then I have a more of an exploration project in Japan. See what other students are on. We have Garrett here, who's on an operating mine. I didn't turn on my video. You can actually see Garrett.
And so, so Midas is kind of an interesting example because Midas is pretty complex. And I think one of the things that I've seen is a lot of industry folks struggle to use grad students' research projects. And it's almost like there's this paper that sits on the shelf. But one of the things that I'd like to see is essentially more collaboration between grad students and industry, where when you guys are working on a project, you say, hey, these things look really interesting. And then you can find ways that it can tie directly into what the industry folks are doing on their projects.
Scott, following up on that, how active is Newmont in trying to, I guess, get that kind of relationship working with universities so that you can, I guess, help fund some students, but also get some valuable information that's not just, a 30-year-old going out and logging core and that's the job.
Yeah, so that's one of the big things that we're working on changing. And so I've been having some conversations internally with our group, and then I'll be discussing with Mary Doherty on ways we can move forward with that. But then also we started doing a graduate program in the recent past, where essentially we're trying to bring people on from especially like schools that we have relationships with, and then try to mentor them more. And so try to follow them as they build their careers. And so I'm actually scheduled to talk to one of our recent graduate program folks soon. That's one of my jobs, is to essentially reach out to them and try to utilize their skills more in industry and specifically at our mines. And also try to make sure that we can, kind of going back to my bio, we want to make sure that we're developing people so that they want to come to Newmont and they want to stay with Newmont. And so that's been becoming a very big focus on our part, but it's kind of just starting out. So it's a little bit of baby steps at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. But that sounds good. I mean, I don't know how closely you're working with mines, but that would be certainly a university to look at and probably follow up and talk more about that. And
that's because that'd be one of the things, like when I was at my previous employer, I was trying to reach out to mines a bit to try and help steer projects a little bit, to answer some specific questions. And I think that's one of my long-term goals in this role, is to have a closer relationship with the universities where we can say, hey, we don't understand this aspect of one of our deposits. We'd like you guys to put together a program just to try and tackle this. And I think what we'll find is when we're actively trying to collaborate with the mines, we'll have a lot more of that communication going on, but it'll also make it so that industry will begin using that data more directly, because it's answering a question we have. And one of the complaints I've had in the past is I've seen some graduate work that didn't have much of an impact on industry because it wasn't answering any questions they had. It was just kind of like a thesis advisor had an idea of what they wanted to answer. And so I think if we can work with the advisors and the faculty, we'll be able to maybe come up with projects that will be mutually interesting to us.
Scott, you started off by talking about integrating a lot of the different geological data, but are you also getting people to do your rock quality index and alteration and so forth, so that you can tell the mining department, here's an area where you have more or less problem with dilution, deletion, or the processing department here, because of the alteration in this area is someplace, maybe we want to stack some stuff off on the side so that you can batch it with a special kind of treatment that gets good recovery for that type of mineralization as opposed to the more general type.
So that's a great question, and that is actually one of the things that we are currently leading an initiative trying to do is essentially share the learnings from the exploration side with the metallurgy and with the mine planning sides, and what we've found from that is there's oftentimes things that we haven't thought of that we could just change a few small things on how we collect data that will be much more useful for like the geotech departments and things like that. And so we have like a global geology group, and one of the things they've been working with is some of those sites to integrate that so that we are collecting better rock quality data, for example, so that the geotechs can use it directly in mine planning. Because one of the things that we were finding is it was almost like a disconnect between what the mine side was needing and what the exploration side was doing. And it's usually just a small change in data collection. And the same goes for the production side. So I just had a conversation yesterday with one of our production superintendents on changing the way we map just a little bit so that it helps us on our exploration modeling. And one of the things that I've personally seen a lot with is, for example, one of our mines here in Colorado, the metallurgy group is taking a lot of samples and running specific analyses on them that we hadn't thought about in terms of how it could help us on exploration. But essentially, it's so that they can mill things better, but it really ties back to alteration, which is one of the things we can use. And so we're trying to make it be a two-way street where we learn from them and then they can learn from us as well. But it's a huge step forward in the industry, I think, to be seeing that change. And some groups, like I know Western Mines in Australia was really good at that, where they essentially had great collaboration across departments. And Newmont is I think our CEO said it's a Goldilocks size company where we're not too big so that people can't be talking to each other, and we're not too small that we're not resourced, but we're just the right size so that we can actually move some of these initiatives forward and talk to the people while still having the funding to try and figure it out.
I think Lou has his hand raised. Lou, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Scott, thank you for your presentation and your open mind to the types of changes that hopefully ultimately would be in the best interest of the industry. You challenge grad students and in the industry as well to bring with them their continued thirst for addressing the whys, if you will, those questions. Where do you see AI going in the future exploration realm, and how AI will impact that challenge that you give those students?
Yes. So that's actually, I think, a really promising field. And I think there's, I think you guys have all seen the chart where it's like, you have the peak of expectation and then the trough of despair, And so I think we're heading up that peak of expectation with AI right now. And then I think in not too far away, we'll hit a trough of despair where people go, oh, it doesn't work. But I think what we're finding in my personal experience has been, I've used Orange, for example, quite a bit to do a lot of machine learning things on when you've begun classifying alteration. It's a fantastic way to both explore with unsupervised learning, are there things that we're not seeing or not expecting, and to try and take a look at what we're seeing with that side of things. And then with supervised learning to say, well, here's what we're seeing in this really detailed logging we've done. Can we apply this back to reinterpreting some of our older drill holes, for example? And then one of the really promising areas, I think, on that is with image recognition. And so, for example, Imago has done a lot of work on it, and I've kind of played around with it. But even doing things like, can you predict poor RQD by looking at core photos and training it to say, these are areas with a rock quality of this, these are areas with significant clay, and running essentially a ton of training images through, and then getting a result back that you can plug back into your modeling. And so some of that stuff looks really promising. The thing that I've seen with industry myself is a very big hesitation to embrace it. And so I really like some of the papers like Antoine, I think it's Kate or Kate, I'm not sure, he's done, and then Sean Hood has done some other ones where they've really dug into like totally industry applicable uses of these. And I found people are really hesitant on the black box side. And I think part of that is, I was a classically trained paper geologist where I learned how to map with a Brunton and a tape underground, and doing lefts and rights to do your own surveys and all that. And I found a lot of people who are used to that aspect of geology are really hesitant to use computers because they are like, I shouldn't say computers, but to use new technologies because they don't understand them. And so I think that's one of the things that I've been personally trying to do is to show people in ways that are easier to understand before you start diving into things like neural networks, which even machine learning people have a hard time explaining. But to start with things like a random forest, where you can say, here's how a decision tree works, which we do when we interpret geochemistry regularly. Here's how a random forest works. And it's easier for people to digest those small steps. And then really the critical thing is showing them successes, right? So instead of trying to, and I've seen a lot of the machine learning or like companies online saying, it'll log all of your core. And geologists going, I don't want any part of that. But instead saying, well, hey, why don't we do this where we come up with a predicted log of your core, and then we can flag differences against your regular log, and we can say, oh, well, these differences, let's investigate those. And when the geologists start digging into those differences, they usually find that there's a reason there's a difference, right? It's, oh, well, that logger was in a hurry, and they didn't have time to actually go through and log this in detail, so we missed it. And so I think a lot of getting industry to accept some of these newer technologies is showing them small successes that let them understand how it works. If that is a really long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's great. Thank you for your perspectives.
Any other questions? So one thing, if nobody else has a question, one thing I might kind of touch on, as you mentioned at the start of your question, was there's almost like a curiosity gets ground out of people as time goes by in industry. And I've seen some really brilliant geologists leave industry because of that. And it's one of the things that we're trying to change with Newmont. Not to say that we're perfect, because every company has its issues, right? So don't get me wrong. But one of the things we are trying to change is that the recognition that we're hiring brilliant people to come and work on our projects, and then we're boring them until they give up on doing geology and want to leave industry. And so we're trying to do a lot more internal research. And one of the things I really like, Roy Woodall from WMC had some great quotes, and he just recently passed away, unfortunately. But he always stressed that our mine geologists, our production geologists, and like any of the geological teams that work on a project should know more about their deposit than researchers coming in, taking 30 samples, going away to the lab and studying them, and then saying, this is what's going on there. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to actually, I think our entire leadership team is trying to change, is getting it so that we start doing more research internally. We start trying to understand our deposits without, not to say that consultants aren't going to be relied on, because they have a use in industry, but that we take that ownership onto us to understand our ore systems and not wait for someone else to tell us what's going on. And that's one of the things where I'm really excited about it, because I think we could have mines reach out to Colorado School of Mines and say, hey, we're trying to understand this aspect. And maybe it doesn't turn into a full graduate program. Maybe it turns into, can we have someone do a little bit of research on this? Can we use the analytical equipment with someone? Like, can we develop essentially partnerships to try and answer some of those questions? And I'm really excited about that, because I think that's something that I saw, like when I'm a huge fan of reading books about successful explorers. That's like, like David Lowell and all these other people who have gone out and written books like Haddon King, if you've ever read The Rocks Speak. That's a fantastic journey into trying to understand their deposit themselves. And I don't know when that changed in industry, but it's something that I want to try to go back to, is really we build that understanding. And so then we hire people with the goal of, you're going to help us build this understanding. And we just had a new hire at Cripple Creek and Victor who is taking a totally new look at that system. And I'm really excited about it, because he has come in essentially with that curiosity still kind of on fire in him, and he's diving right into it. And so it's fun for me, because I can spend a couple hours helping him on a project, and then walk away and come back and he's done like tons more. And that's really what I want to see us do.
Scott, there are a number of questions still in the chat.
Oh, let me stop sharing my screen, and maybe I can see the chat. There we go.
Hey, Scott, I don't have a question. I just have a quick comment on what you were just saying about building relationships with universities. I don't think Jiaxian is on this call, Jiaxian Cheng at Mines, but I know for a fact that's something that he wants to build with various companies. So that's somebody who you could reach out to and get something going pretty quickly, I think, on that.
And what was his name, so I can make a note of it?
It's Jiaxian Cheng. He's one of the faculty here at Mines.
Okay. I think I saw a thing about him recently, actually, now that I think about it. And so it's J-A-O, how do you spell it?
Oh,
you
it's Z-H-A-O and then S-H-A-N. And
Okay.
then last name is Chang, C-H-A-N-G.
All right, I will follow up with him.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Mary just put it in the chat. So yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Oh, thanks. And someone put it on the chat. Thanks, Mary.
I have a comment here, John Dreyer. I worked for Bear Creek Mining Company, Kennecott, in the 1960s and early 70s. And that organization had a rather large exploration research group that we as field geologists, we interacted with them all the time. Among the people there were Art Rose, Dennis Norton, Dick Nielsen, and a whole bunch of other people, geochemists, geophysicists, geologists, and it was an ongoing relationship. And from what I can see, the major mining companies have done away with that.
So one of the things, Newmont's restructured it a bit, but we still have, so essentially that's what the Global Geology Group is. So it was it was called the GES group before, which Mary actually was leading. And so we still have a lot of that, essentially experts to lean on to help us with questions on whether it's geochemistry or geophysics, structural geology and modeling. And so they're a resource, and like one of my primary jobs in Newmont is to facilitate that group discussing with the mines to answer questions and to help us with our understanding. And so I would say that Newmont's one of the few companies that is still pursuing that, though it has been scaled back compared to where it was in the pure research space not long ago.
In Kennecott, it was a little different than that, in that the research people were there. You know, they were back and forth. They were writing papers. They were doing research on individual mineral deposits. They were always interacting with exploration and mine geologists. So it was a constant. It was not like they were separated someplace, but they were constantly there.
I think that's a really important point of it, right? Is because then if someone's like when I worked in Australia, we had an embedded researcher that sat right next to me, and we would just be able to talk as we're there. And I think that's one of the things you lose with a group that is traveling a lot, is that face-to-face interaction. And so it's definitely something that that we could improve on for sure. I'd be curious to hear more about your thoughts on that at some point. If you wouldn't mind shooting me an email, and we could chat more.
Absolutely.
Oh, so then let me look at some of the questions on the side. So someone was asking, how did the leapfrog model go into Vulkan or whatever to use resource models, or use as a resource model? So the main way we do things is just using like a DXF output. And so then you can bring it into Vulkan. There's some really critical setup on Leapfrog where you have to set the downhole survey method to be the same as Vulkan, so that the shapes are actually in the same place. Otherwise, you'll have a garbage estimate. So what we'll do is we'll create our geological shapes, like unit context, things like that, and then our ore system domains, and then you export them as DXF, and then you bring them into Vulkan, and you flag your blocks and your drill holes by those domains and geological units. And so then essentially you can run an estimation. So the two play really well with each other nowadays, which is nice. So then Mary asked a question on if I could comment on the data that's most lacking for the models. That's a really good question. So I think there's a lot of the we don't know what we don't know yet. And so I think there'll be a lot of things that get added into modeling over the next several years that we just aren't quite aware of yet. But one of the biggest ones that we are aware of and we're actively addressing right now is structural data. So there's been a huge lack of using structural data, like things as simple as foliations and then intersection lineations and stretching lineations. And we're addressing that within Newmont right now with what we're calling a structure sprint. And so it's essentially an effort to completely revamp how Newmont uses structural data in the geological modeling space. And then going back to your next question is, will technology bring an improvement to uniform data collection? I absolutely believe it will. So one of the things, like obviously analytical technologies have gotten better. So, like things like 4-acid digest is really cost effective these days. And even doing like complete characterization is fairly cost effective. And I think our next step on that is the interpretation of that data. And so bringing it beyond one expert being able to use it in iogas, we're trying to train people up on iogas more. Like training is always a part of it. But I really think this is one of the areas that machine learning is gonna really shine in, is essentially when we do geochemical analysis in iogas, typically we're doing it with only a few variables at a time, or at best we're doing like a principal component analysis and starting to try and look in a different non-3D space, as it were, but like principal component space. But I think that is one of the areas that what I've seen in machine learning has been far beyond what I can do manually. And then when I can back check it, it deals with the exceptions a lot better, where maybe if you do a ternary diagram and you try to classify a sample in a specific rock unit, well, maybe all of the rare earth elements show that it doesn't really belong there, but the immobiles did. And so I really like that side of things. And then the other big one, and kind of going back to someone's question earlier, is I think geotechnical data will see a big improvement in technology with some of the core scanning data that's out there. And with things like the laser scanning and 3D profiling of core, you can see broken zones empirically, as opposed to having to train someone like with a lot of skill to log that accurately. And then the other big one being things like pyrite percentages. People are generally terrible at estimating percentages, myself included, where, you know, one person's 1% will be another person's 5%. And you can, like when I used to do a lot of modeling work, you could throw in the log percentages of whatever. It could be pyrite, it could be vein percentages, it could be anything. And you could basically sort it by logger, because the percentages were all over the place and you couldn't actually model anything. And I see like Imago's work on that being huge, where you can start classifying from your imagery, this is pyrite, this is pyrrhotite, this is sphalerite, and then have it go through, scan through the core and say, okay, this part of the core has 8% sphalerite and this part of the core has 1% pyrite. And oh, there's a change from pyrite to pyrrhotite over here. And I think that's going to be a massive change in how we can improve our models. And it's really close, but not quite there yet. And then the other one is things like taking our halo, our spectral data, and processing it through AI Cyrus. We get a much more quantitative value back from that. And that's a lot easier to look at in modeling terms. So then Ian asked if, do we see televiewers being more widely used in mineral exploration and mining over oriented core, for example? This is one of the things that's been, to date, no. To date, only a few companies have really made strides forward in televiewer usage. And it's kind of frustrating to me because I've seen huge value come from it. And a lot of people will only look at one of the televiewers. They'll look at optical televiewers as opposed to acoustic. Be like, oh, we couldn't use televiewers because we have muddy water in the core holes after we're done drilling. And then, well, why couldn't you use acoustic? And it's like, oh, we didn't look at it. And then I think the other issue is, this is another big area where technology will bring a huge benefit. Because when you get a televiewer log back, so many geologists are hard pressed to interpret that log and use it in their modeling. And I think if we start looking at, you know, like using, like, for example, machine learning on that, we'll start to be able to classify a little bit better, and then maybe we'll have a little bit better utilization of it. But my personal experience has been, it's fantastic. You can use it on RC holes, where obviously you can never get an orientation from core. And then also with core orientations, I've seen hugely variable qualities of orientation, both being done by the geologists and by the drill helpers. And so I think televiewers can address a lot of that. Any other questions? Kind of rambled on a long time, sorry.
Yeah, you unmute myself. Well, if there are no other questions, I don't think there's any in the chat that I've missed, but thanks, Scott, so much. That was a great presentation, and lots that I actually want to follow up on with you. Yeah, let's see. I think we're good. Well, thanks again. That was awesome. Thank you for taking the time today, and the presentation was great regardless. So
I like to think it would have been better if I hadn't crashed out a PowerPoint, but you know, wishes were horses.
It always happens at the last minute when you really need it not to.
It's Murphy's Law of presentations, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Just like when you're typing your thesis, your computer dies, and that's it. Months of work. So exactly,
it's always hard. But thanks very much for the opportunity, and then I'd encourage you guys to connect with me on LinkedIn and or shoot me an email. I am always happy to answer questions from people, and then I'm always obviously happy to recruit people into Newmont. So.
You're gonna get flooded now, I think.
No, we welcome it. So
Thanks so much, everybody.
yep, thanks guys, appreciate it.